standing on a cold wall in Berlin, Patrick, and you got a job offer from Baghdad. Did you make it to Baghdad?
Well, you know, as exciting as times are in 2012, believe it or not, back in 1990, things were even more exciting, because not only had the Berlin Wall come down, but suddenly I did make it to Baghdad. And this was a period, of course, that the Iran-Iraq war was on. And when I went into my apartment on the first night, the windows were just covered in black tape, you know, and I was saying, what's all this about? And that was in case a missile hit from Tehran in the middle of the night, that the glass wouldn't splinter, you know, sort of and cut on you. It was the period of the War of the Cities was just about ending. And I started my first day, I suppose, working in the hospital. It was absolutely a wonderful experience, but the card they had given me was a Nissan Patrol by Staff Health. My nurse was Pauline, but the nurse that was there before was Daphne Parish. And if you remember, in the period, Daphne Parish had been arrested with Fazraf Bazrov, who was a journalist from the Guardian newspaper, or the Observer, I think it was the Guardian actually, and they'd been out at one of the missile sites that had blown up where 300 people were killed, and they'd been held, and Iraq probably acted a little stupidly to an extent, because they beheaded Fazraf Bazrov, they gave Daphne Parish a life sentence, and the car that they had used to collect some soil samples, you know, out of the missile site was the car that was given me on arrival in Baghdad. It was a Staff Health, you know, sort of Nissan Patrol from the Ibn al-Battar hospital. I found Baghdad absolutely fascinating. You know, this was a city that was once, you know, the centre of the known world. This was a city where Tamerlane the Great in 1284 had come and killed 300,000 people. You remember they said that the waters of the Tigris ran red with the bloods of the people for 3 days, and then blue with the ink from all the libraries. So when the Mongols came, and Tamerlane the Great was, I think, the grandson of Genghis Khan, they wiped out all civilization. And this was a city, believe it or not, that was doing gallbladder removals, was doing cataract, you know, sort of replacements, and was putting on plaster of Paris when the streets of Paris and London were still filth dirt beds, you know. I mean, it's only about the 17 or 1800s that suddenly you've got a sanitation, we'll say, in the European cities. But these things all existed in Baghdad in that period. Now, the Mongols destroyed the city. They knocked back, I suppose, to a period of almost 26 miles on either side of the Tigris, all the irrigation. You remember the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, everything got there. They wiped out all that. But sort of rather to sort of, I suppose, bore you with the background to the history of it, it's just that I found the city so fascinating. I suppose most places where I travel, I would tend to feel the spirits of the ancestors around me in a way that other people never did. And I found that particularly in Africa, Cecil Rhodes and a lot of other people. But we were treating patients in a tertiary referral centre. One of my jobs was particularly 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, patients who had aplastic anemia or no immune response. They were in ICU, they developed blood poison, septicemia. I'd have to go and tap them for, I suppose, in 3 different places to get blood cultures. And we did notice, believe it or not, that an awful lot of the people were coming from Kurdistan, up in the north near Suleimani and on the border with Iran. A suspicion had, I suppose, gone round the hospital, or rather a rumour did, particularly after the Sunday Times produced, I suppose, documentative evidence that in Al-Habalya, Saddam Hussein's army had dropped Cyclone B and some other forms of gas and had wiped out 5,000 or 5,500 of the population.
Terrible.
Absolutely. So my inquisitive nature, whatever, brought me to the area. I got a taxi, went 300 or 400 miles up into the area, met with the Peshmerga, which were the freedom fighters, I suppose, of the Kurdistani people.
Were you scared, Patrick?
No, I've never really been scared in any of the things I do in life, from the point of view that you almost have an intrinsic feeling that you're going to come out the other end of it. I travelled in a period, I suppose, when there was no emails, no text messages, and as a consequence I often had to travel alone. I went, I suppose, into the area, and on the way back out again we were arrested. That's myself and the taxi driver, Mohammed, by the Iraqi army. Things got a bit rough then. They held me in the police station. They didn't get all my photographs. They certainly took some of them, and they gave me a year's jail sentence.
So you actually took photographs of everything you'd seen at that time?
Oh, absolutely.
As well,
don't forget also I'm writing, you know, during this period. You know what I mean? I originally had written, you know, sort of a cameo thing for Manor Herald. Then I also, you know, had got a column with the Irish Medical Times and with the sort of Irish Medical News, and as a consequence I was always reporting back home, so it gave me a great insight. To an extent I was almost like a journalist on the ground, and very few people had got into the area, particularly Westerners, and they held on to me and roughed me up a bit, but not in any serious way. But I mean, you'd go to bed at night time hearing the screams of other, sort of captives and prisoners, and most probably the taxi man, sort of, which was a bit disconcerting. They didn't get my license, so that sort of, I had the Jeep, but one morning, only about 5 days into it, this colonel came down to me and said, "You think we're all barbarians here, do you?" And of course I'm not going to say yes I do, but he says, "Well, I know Trinity College, I know James Joyce," and he put my arm up behind my back and hustled me a bit up through his friends to this door and threw me outside, and I didn't know what was happening. And then the door opened and he threw out my yellow knapsack, my cameras, some photographs, and this was after, sort of days of interrogation, actually, as to who I was. I thought I was an American spy. And then I had to do a long walk, sort of back to where the gate was. It was a bit like Billy Hayes and Midnight Express. Honestly, I didn't know whether I was going to get shot or not. And then I sort of went back to the door and sort of said, what about Mohammed? Sort of, and I knew that I wasn't going to get anywhere, get the hell out of there. And I got a taxi back to Baghdad. I met Chris Duckling, who was a microbiologist, and Chris got my gear. I flew straight out of the country, lucky enough. I went to Copenhagen. That was the 26th of July 1990, and I was at the Galway races 2 days into August, watching TV when I seen that Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait. And all my friends in the hospital were held as hostages, believe it or not. So I was the lucky one. 1 week before, I was the hostage and they were all free. And then here I was standing looking at the television, and 450 of my friends in the hospital were all held as the hostages in Desert Shield.
Just before we go to the news, Patrick, I'm interested, you mentioned Mohammed, your taxi driver. Did you ever find out what happened to Mohammed?
I presume that Mohammed never seen the light of day, and I mean that in no sort of casting aspersions. I didn't, but I know the Iraq of the period, and certainly he got a much harder time than I did.
Patrick, can you give us your next piece of music, which will lead us into the news?
Surely. I would like to play Nessun Dorma by Luciano Pavarotti. I met Luciano on a couple of occasions before he died, and I was at his funeral, and certainly I think that'd be a nice memory.
Sunshine Meets on Dublin's new Sunshine 106.8.
You're listening to Sunshine Meets. My name is Graham Day, and my special guest this evening is Dr. Patrick Treacy, cosmetic doctor, entrepreneur, best medical journalist in 03, best medical clinician in 05, a personal